The night sky stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glowing beneath me like a scattered sea of diamonds. The polished marble floors of the penthouse reflected every shimmer of light, but none of it felt as steady as it once had. Each corner of the home carried a memory. The dinners, the laughter, the quiet mornings with coffee. But lately, even the silence echoed differently. I had built my life here, layer by layer, sacrifice by sacrifice, yet there came a moment when I realized nothing in these walls was as secure as I thought. The velvet curtains, the chilled champagne, the carefully chosen art, all of it could vanish in a single breath, claimed by someone who never truly understood what it cost me to stand in this space. So, I decided if the world I had created was going to be taken from me, I would be the one to decide how the story unfolded. The penthouse wasn't just a residence perched high above the city, it was a living testament to every sacrifice, every sleepless night, and every quiet decision made in pursuit of a dream. From the very first day I stepped into its gleaming expanse, I knew it symbolized far more than an address or a place to sleep. It was an achievement carved out of determination, a sanctuary that reflected not only luxury, but the very essence of perseverance. Every polished marble tile beneath my feet carried the weight of battles fought in silence, and every crystal chandelier that lit the rooms sparkled with the fragments of ambition that had been pieced together carefully over time. The view, stretching endlessly across the skyline, served as a reminder that I had risen above challenges that once seemed insurmountable. Each corner of that penthouse whispered stories of resilience, of courage, of a life built not from chance, but from unrelenting willpower. It wasn't simply about the beauty or the price tag attached to the property. Luxury in itself meant very little if it lacked substance. For me, the penthouse embodied the validation that hard work, endurance, and vision could create something tangible and permanent. Every item within its walls had been chosen with intention. The sleek furniture, imported art pieces, and curated decor weren't displays of vanity. They were milestones, tokens of moments where I had pushed through limits and reached the next peak. The carefully arranged spaces, the balance of modern elegance with warmth, spoke of a life not given but earned. To live in such a place wasn't about boasting. It was about existing daily in an environment that reminded me of how far I had come, and how much further I could go. There were mornings when I would stand barefoot on the balcony, the cool stone under my feet grounding me, as the city slowly stirred awake below. Those moments were intimate conversations with myself, silent acknowledgments of battles no one else saw. To others, the penthouse might have seemed like excess, but to me, it was a mirror of a journey that had been anything but easy. The walls carried laughter and pain alike, but above all, they carried proof that persistence pays off. Even the quietest spaces, the library with shelves lined in leather-bound books, the kitchen with its sleek counters, the master suite draped in serenity, were more than just rooms. They were sanctuaries carved from grit and discipline. Every guest who walked through the door often marveled at the grandeur, but very few understood what it took to sustain such a life. The penthouse was not a gift placed in my hands. It was a creation, one decision at a time, one risk at a time. To step into it was to step into a narrative of resilience, each detail reflecting choices that demanded courage. Its presence was proof that dreams could be built into walls, into views, into spaces that seemed untouchable to the outside world. In every sense, it stood as my fortress above the noise, my own carved-out piece of the sky. When life downstairs in the world grew chaotic or uncertain, the penthouse stood firm, a reminder that I had risen high above those storms before. There was comfort in its stability, its quiet luxury, its permanence. It gave me strength on days when everything else threatened to unravel. And yet, even with its commanding presence and the sense of power it seemed to give, I also recognized something deeper, that this space wasn't just about comfort or beauty. It was about identity. To lose it would mean to lose not just walls and possessions, but pieces of myself that had been stitched into every choice that brought me there. That understanding made its significance even more profound. The penthouse was more than glass, steel, and marble. It was a story. A story of climbing, of claiming, of carving out space where once there was none. It was my reminder that success is never accidental, and that to stand so high above the city wasn't luck. It was the inevitable result of refusing to settle, of refusing to let go of vision even when the weight of life pressed heavily against me. It was not just a home but a crown, worn quietly each day, gleaming in silence against the city lights. There comes a moment in life when the realization dawns that nothing, no matter how grand or secure it may seem, is truly untouchable. The penthouse, with all its towering strength and lavish beauty, once felt like a fortress. I believed the sheer weight of its presence, the magnitude of what it represented, could stand against any storm. Yet slowly, in quiet moments when the air felt heavier than usual, I began to see that even the strongest walls can tremble if the foundation beneath them is tested. Luxury has a way of deceiving the mind into believing permanence exists. The gleaming marble floors, the priceless artwork, the view that stretched endlessly across the skyline, they seemed invincible, eternal. But as life unfolded, I learned that material things, no matter how expensive, could be threatened in a single decision, a single betrayal, a single twist of fate. The illusion of untouchable security is often woven tightly with comfort. I once walked through each room with an almost careless confidence, knowing everything within those walls belonged to me. The thought that it could all slip away never crossed my mind. That was the fragility of it all. I had mistaken luxury for safety, forgetting that ownership is not just about possession, but about power, and power is always vulnerable to being shifted, taken, or lost. The realization hit me slowly, like cracks spreading across glass. At first, they were small, moments when I felt unsettled, when I sensed that the life I had built wasn't as protected as I thought. Eventually, those cracks grew wider, and I could no longer deny that everything I had poured myself into could disappear with frightening ease. It was a sobering truth. Luxury had given me a sense of invulnerability, a cushion that made me believe I was beyond the reach of loss. But life has its way of stripping away illusions, forcing you to confront reality without the veil of comfort. Standing in the penthouse, looking out at the glittering skyline, I began to understand that I was not above the storms of life. The city lights were constant, but my place above them was not. The penthouse was a jewel, yes, but jewels can be stolen, sold, or shattered. Nothing about its walls, its ceilings, or even the land it stood upon was unshakable. What I thought was permanent was, in truth, always hanging by threads invisible to me until I looked closer. This realization carried a weight heavier than I expected. To see something I once thought eternal as fragile forced me to reevaluate everything. I began to notice how easily the trappings of wealth could be manipulated. The documents, the names on deeds, the quiet legalities that govern what is mine and what is not. These were vulnerabilities I had overlooked. I had believed my presence, my labor, my sacrifices had carved the penthouse into something beyond reach. But in truth, it existed in a world governed by rules that did not honor sweat or effort, only signatures and power. That knowledge was jarring, a stark reminder that even what seems most secure can be pulled away with little warning. The irony was that the more beautiful and valuable something is, the more fragile it becomes. Priceless art can be destroyed by a single careless move. A crystal chandelier can shatter in an instant. A penthouse perched above the city can be emptied with nothing more than a decision on paper. Luxury is not invincibility, it is delicacy dressed in glamour. For years I had wrapped myself in its security, only to see the truth unravel before my eyes. Nothing about the space I loved so deeply was immune to change, loss, or betrayal. It could all vanish and I could be left staring at empty walls where laughter once echoed. There was both fear and freedom in realizing this. Fear, because the ground beneath me felt less steady, because the illusion of permanence had been shattered. Freedom, because once the truth is seen, you can no longer live in denial. You are forced to understand that strength must come from within, not from walls of marble or windows of glass. The penthouse was not eternal, it was a chapter. It could be taken, altered, destroyed, or replaced. But the resilience that built it, that was something no one could steal. In seeing the fragility of everything I thought untouchable, I came to understand the importance of being ready to let go, to fight, or to transform when the time came. Luxury could crumble, but I would remain. It began in ways so subtle that at first I brushed them aside as nothing more than passing thoughts. The penthouse had always felt like the safest place in the world, an impenetrable fortress suspended above the chaos of the city. But slowly, tiny cracks began to form, not in the walls themselves, but in the feeling of security I once carried with me so effortlessly. I started to notice moments that didn't sit quite right, shifts in tone, glances that lingered too long, or silences that felt heavier than they should have. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, just a quiet undercurrent that whispered to me when I tried to sleep at night. Something was shifting, and though the marble floors still gleamed and the chandeliers still sparkled, the energy inside those walls no longer felt unshakable. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination. How could anything be wrong when I was surrounded by so much stability, so much proof of what I had built? Yet the unease refused to leave. The security I once felt in the penthouse began to waver when I noticed how quickly comfort could turn into complacency. The people around me didn't admire what I had built in the same way I did. Their eyes lingered not on the memories or meaning woven into every detail but on the surface, on the price tags, the extravagance, the ownership. It was in those subtle glances, in the quiet shifting of conversations, that I realized my security was more fragile than I had believed. The very things that made the penthouse extraordinary also made it vulnerable, tempting, and easy for others to covet. The realization deepened with each encounter. I noticed how paperwork suddenly became more important, how discussions that once felt casual began to carry undertones of control. It was no longer about appreciating the life we had, but about measuring it, labeling it, calculating its worth. What I had always seen as the culmination of my sacrifices began to feel like a target. The penthouse itself was still the same, towering, luxurious, breathtaking, but the sense of safety I had once wrapped myself in started to slip away. It was as if invisible hands were already reaching into the space, trying to claim it piece by piece, while I stood quietly, trying to pretend nothing was changing. It wasn't just the practical side of things that unsettled me. Emotionally, I felt a shift as well. Where once I felt celebrated, I now felt scrutinized. Where once the walls echoed with laughter, they now carried an unspoken tension. I could no longer walk into a room without sensing the possibility that my place there was being questioned. It was in the way conversations ended abruptly when I entered, in the way certain details were suddenly hidden, in the way small, careless words hinted at bigger intentions. It was like watching the edge of a storm roll in, beautiful in its power, terrifying in its inevitability. The penthouse began to feel less like a sanctuary, and more like a stage where unseen battles were being played out. I found myself second-guessing the smallest things. A misplaced document, a subtle shift in tone, an unexpected question about ownership. All of it added to the growing sense that my security was slipping through my fingers. I had never been one to dwell on fear, but the thought that everything I had worked for could suddenly be at risk haunted me more than I wanted to admit. In those moments I realized how fragile even the grandest structures can feel when trust begins to falter. The penthouse no longer seemed unshakable. Instead, it became a symbol of what could be lost if I wasn't careful, if I didn't pay attention to the quiet warning signs. The safety I once took for granted had transformed into something I had to defend. Every detail of the home, from the balcony where I once watched the sunrise to the grand living room that had hosted countless evenings, now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. The more I noticed, the clearer it became. Security isn't destroyed in one single moment. It erodes slowly, in whispers and shadows, until the foundation begins to tremble. I understood then that the penthouse could not protect me if I wasn't vigilant. Its walls might be strong, but they could not shield me from the intentions of others. The shift was undeniable, and though the signs had started subtly, they grew louder each day until I could no longer ignore them. The sense of comfort that had once been my greatest luxury was giving way to something else, an urgent awareness that stability is only as strong as the hands that hold it. Trust had always been the silent foundation beneath everything, the invisible thread that made the walls of the penthouse feel unshakable. I believed in the permanence of what I had built, not just in the physical sense, but in the relationships and bonds that surrounded it. That trust gave me the courage to let my guard down, to believe I didn't need to question the security of my place in the world. But as subtle signs grew louder, and the air within my sanctuary shifted, that thread began to fray. What once felt like loyalty began to feel like calculation, and the comfort of trust started giving way to the raw instinct of survival. The transition wasn't sudden, it crept in slowly, until one day I realized I no longer felt safe in the same way I once had. The hardest part was admitting to myself that trust had become a luxury I could no longer afford. It was easier to pretend at first, to tell myself that the tension I felt was nothing more than stress or overthinking. Yet each encounter proved otherwise. I began to see the difference between words meant to soothe and actions designed to take. Conversations that once carried warmth now carried strategy, every sentence layered with unspoken meaning. I could hear it in the pauses, see it in the eyes that avoided mine at just the wrong moment. Trust began to feel like a trap, something that left me exposed, vulnerable, open to losing everything I had worked so hard to secure. That was the moment the shift began, the moment I realized I could no longer depend on trust to protect me. The penthouse, with all its beauty and grandeur, was suddenly a place where I needed to guard myself. The laughter and ease that once filled its rooms now felt like a memory, replaced by silence thick with suspicion. I could no longer walk barefoot across the marble floors without the awareness that every detail around me might be slipping out of my hands if I wasn't careful. Trust, once a gift, had transformed into a liability. From that realization grew the instinct of self-preservation. I started noticing everything I had once overlooked. The paperwork tucked into drawers, the way conversations veered toward ownership, the casual remarks that hinted at entitlement. My eyes opened to the possibility that what I thought was mine, what I believed was untouchable, could be claimed if I continued to rely on blind faith. Trusting meant leaving myself unprotected, and I could no longer afford that kind of vulnerability. My focus shifted inward. I stopped giving answers too freely, stopped assuming others saw the penthouse through the same lens I did. What was a home to me was an opportunity to others, and realizing that forced me to recalibrate how I existed within my own walls. Self-preservation didn't mean fear, it meant clarity. It meant acknowledging that I was the only one who truly understood the value of what I had built, and that I alone had to ensure it remained intact. Where trust once guided my decisions, caution took its place. I started moving with a sharper awareness, listening more than speaking, watching more than acting. Each choice I made was deliberate, each step calculated not from paranoia but from necessity. Trust had been about believing in the permanence of others, but self-preservation was about believing in myself and my ability to guard what I had built. It was not an easy transformation. There were moments I longed to go back, to feel that ease again, to walk through the penthouse with the lightness of someone who never had to question the ground beneath their feet. But life has a way of reminding you that once innocence is lost, it cannot be reclaimed. I could not unsee what I had begun to notice, could not unknow the fragility of the security I once held so tightly. The only way forward was to accept the shift fully, to step into the role of protector instead of dreamer. The penthouse became less about comfort and more about strategy. Every detail that once felt like decoration now felt like evidence of my effort, something that needed guarding, something worth fighting for. I began to understand that survival, in spaces like this, meant more than just existing. It meant being ready to defend, to shield, to hold on even when others tried to pry it away. Trust was a luxury that had made me vulnerable, but self-preservation gave me strength. It gave me the clarity to see that while others might have the power to threaten my world, I had the resilience to decide how the story would unfold. The moment came when hesitation was no longer an option. For so long, I had tried to convince myself that the ground beneath me was steady, that the cracks forming around my life could be ignored. But when the subtle unease grew too loud to dismiss, I realized I had a choice to make. Either I could stand by passively, hoping that what I had built would remain mine, or I could step forward and reclaim control before it all slipped away. The decision was not made in anger or fear, but in clarity. I could see the path ahead with striking sharpness if I didn't act. Everything I had sacrificed, every detail I had poured myself into, could be taken by someone who had never carried its weight. That thought alone was enough to ignite the fire I needed. Taking back control began in quiet ways. I became meticulous with what I said, with what I shared, with how I moved through the penthouse. Every word spoken was measured, every action deliberate. I stopped letting others dictate the pace of conversations or the terms of agreements. Instead, I began setting the rhythm, steering the direction in ways that protected me rather than exposed me. This wasn't just about preserving possessions. It was about preserving the years of labor, dreams and sacrifices that had made the penthouse more than just a home. I realized that the only way to ensure its survival was to become an active force rather than a passive participant in its fate. The shift in me was almost imperceptible at first. Outwardly, I remained calm, composed, even gracious. But internally, a new determination began to harden. I studied every detail that could work in my favor: the papers, the timelines, the small oversights others made when they underestimated me. I had once believed my strength lay in trust, but now I understood it lay in awareness, in using every ounce of intelligence and resilience to secure what was mine. The penthouse was not a prize to be handed over, it was a legacy I had to guard. And in that realization, I found a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. With each step I took, the fear of losing everything began to shrink, replaced by the steady rhythm of resolve. The more I acted with intention, the less control others seemed to hold. I began anticipating moves before they were made, preparing myself for possibilities that once would have caught me off guard. The penthouse, once a fragile symbol of security, became a battlefield where my determination outweighed any threat against me. I no longer felt like someone waiting for things to unravel. I became the one weaving the narrative, making choices that kept the power in my hands. This decision to reclaim control wasn't without cost. It required a part of me to harden, to set aside the longing for ease and simplicity. I had to learn how to detach from the illusions of comfort and look at everything with sharp, pragmatic eyes. But in doing so, I gained something far more valuable than false security. I gained strength, the kind of strength that isn't shaken by others' intentions, the kind that doesn't crumble when faced with betrayal. I learned that to preserve what is yours, you sometimes have to transform into someone willing to fight. Not with rage but with clarity and precision. What surprised me most was how liberating it felt. For so long I had carried the weight of fear that my world might collapse without warning. But by making the decision to act, to claim control before it was stripped from me, I took that power back. No longer did I feel like the walls of the penthouse were closing in on me. Instead, they stood taller, fortified by my determination. The space felt different, alive again, filled not with unease but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide my fate. That choice, though difficult, was a turning point. It taught me that control is not given, it is taken, seized in moments when everything feels uncertain. It is the refusal to let others dictate the story you've written with your own sacrifices. It is the awareness that stability is something you must actively guard, not passively expect. And while the path was not easy, I knew it was the only way forward. To protect what mattered, I had to stop waiting for permission and start reclaiming my place, one deliberate step at a time. There is a moment when fear gives way to clarity, when vulnerability transforms into strength, and you stop asking what might happen if you lose everything, and start asking what will happen if you claim it all instead. That was the shift that happened within me. For so long I had walked a fine line between holding on and letting go, weighed down by the tension of not knowing which way things would fall. But when I finally chose action, when I decided that my story would not end with loss, something inside me ignited. It was no longer about protecting pieces of what I had built. It was about stepping fully into empowerment, embracing the power I'd always carried but had been too cautious to wield. The transformation didn't happen overnight. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible, a change in posture, a calmness in my voice, an unshakable steadiness in my decisions. I stopped looking over my shoulder and started looking ahead. Where once I had felt as though I was defending myself against invisible threats, I now began to see opportunities. Every piece of the life I had created, every inch of the penthouse, became a reminder that I had the strength not only to keep what was mine, but to rise higher by refusing to let fear dictate my choices. Empowerment was not loud or dramatic, it was quiet, steady, and absolute. It lived in the certainty that I could decide the outcome. Taking decisive action meant rewriting the narrative. I was no longer the one bracing for loss, I was the one in control of the game. The penthouse stopped feeling like a fragile treasure I might lose, and instead became a throne from which I could build the next chapter of my life. I started seeing myself not as someone who had to defend what I had, but as someone who could expand, claim more, take everything that was rightfully mine. The shift was intoxicating. not in a reckless way, but in the way that comes when you finally stop doubting yourself. The vulnerability that had once left me sleepless became fuel, sharpening my instincts, strengthening my resolve, pushing me to act with clarity instead of hesitation. This transformation was about more than just possessions. It was about identity. I realized that for too long, I had tied my worth to the security of the penthouse, to the illusion that the walls around me defined my strength. But as I stepped into empowerment, I saw the truth. The strength was never in the marble floors or the glittering view. It was in me. I was the one who had built this life, the one who had carried the weight, the one who had the power to decide whether it all crumbled or stood tall. Recognizing that shifted everything. I stopped waiting for someone else to acknowledge my value and began living it myself. There was an energy in those days, a kind of awakening I had never felt before. I could feel the balance of power tilt in my favor with each deliberate choice I made. People around me noticed the change even if they couldn't name it. They saw it in my eyes, in the way I spoke without hesitation, in the way I no longer entertained games or half-truths. My empowerment didn't need explanation. It was evident in the way I carried myself, in the silence that spoke louder than any defense ever could. I was no longer the one being tested. I was the one setting the terms. What empowerment gave me, more than anything else, was freedom. Freedom from the fear of losing everything. Freedom from the illusion that others held power over my life. Freedom from the shadows of doubt that had once lingered in the corners of every room. By embracing decisive action, I took back not just my home but my voice, my authority, my sense of self. I could see clearly that I had never been powerless. I had simply needed the moment of realization to step fully into what I had always possessed. The journey from vulnerability to empowerment was not gentle. It demanded courage, demanded letting go of trust, demanded accepting truths I had once avoided. But in doing so, I uncovered a strength I didn't know I had. I learned that empowerment is not about taking what belongs to others, but about refusing to let others strip away what belongs to you. It is about standing firm in the face of threats and deciding that no one else will write your story. In that transformation, I discovered the kind of resilience that cannot be shaken, the kind that turns loss into power and endings into beginnings. And with that strength, I no longer felt like someone who might lose everything. I became the one who could take everything instead. In the end, what I discovered was that strength doesn't come from the walls of a penthouse or the shimmer of luxury, but from the ability to rise when everything you hold dear is threatened. What began as subtle cracks in my sense of security turned into a revelation that nothing, no matter how grand, is untouchable unless you claim it with conviction. I moved from trust to self-preservation, from hesitation to decisive action, and finally from vulnerability to empowerment. The penthouse was more than a symbol of wealth. It was the canvas of my sacrifices, my resilience, and my will to stand tall when others tried to strip it away. By taking control, I reclaimed not only what was mine but also the unshakable certainty that no one else could define my worth. In that decision, I didn't just protect my life, I transformed it into something even stronger.